Tormentor routes, what they're going to be skipping, what they're going to be using to empower themselves. Let's see what both of these teams have in store for us. Let's get that bread as Baguette and Practice get rolling.
All right, enough. Definitely enough with those plans. We have to. We need to talk about this afterwards. But anyway, we'll see what Practice is going to show us today here versus Baguette. It is the number 10 seed versus the number 15 seed, so it definitely could be a very interesting series here as we're going to get into this DOS. Also interested in what kind of comp they're going to be playing. I would assume we're going to see Shadow Priest again, which is something we've seen a lot in the other side last weekend as well. And on top of that, we have Bursting, which means that the Shadow Priests are going to be incredibly valuable with that Master Spell too.
Yeah, that is such a huge piece of utility that spec brings, so I agree. I think this would be a fantastic dungeon to deploy a Shadow Priest. Once you're doing that, maybe that informs the rest of your comp a little bit as well. Maybe you want to be playing like the Fire Mage, Vengeance, Demon Hunter, stuff that synergizes well around the Fire Mage, so yeah, that's my money on the comps is something like Vengeance, Demon Hunter, Holy Paladin, like Shadow Priest, Frost Mage, and then question mark. And that question mark could be maybe even something like an Affliction lock in this dungeon. I think it's something that we've seen a little bit, and depending on if they think it works on these affixes, I think it could be good.
Yeah, I agree. Affliction lock definitely would fit into that comp as well. You can also just throw a Windwalker in there, even if the whole team is more of a magic comp. I think Windwalker is so good at the moment, especially on their AoE kind of burst that they have, that it doesn't even matter if they have any sort of buffs going on for them. They're still gonna be good. So there it is. We're going in as we see only one Shadow Priest actually on Baguette's side. As Praxis is not playing that priest, they have the Windwalker Rogue plus Frost Mage comp, while Baguette is playing the Shadow Priest Rogue and also a Frost Mage.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what the rogues are going to be up to here. They are both on that subtlety spec that has been it's been the one we've been seeing used this time around in the MDI, and it works really nicely on pulls like this that you can see from Practice, because there are those two really high health mobs that is really good to funnel some eviscerates into off of all these low health mobs that you don't care as much about.
Yeah, and we already see a difference in route 2 as Practice is going to that right side while Baguette immediately walks into that Arden Wield area. They didn't do any trash whatsoever, just walked straight through as they're already in their Arden Wield area. Practice dealing with the Tormentor too, on top of the Death Speaker pack. That can be decently difficult to deal with, but not a problem for them with that priority damage that they have with both the Rogue and the Frost Mage.
One thing that Practice is doing here, because they have that mage on their team, is they're actually letting that cast, the buff cast, go off so that the mage can spell steal it. That's an important little thing to do on this sort of pull when you have those Death Speakers, is to let your mage just get that spell steal instead of interrupting, as is the kind of DPS player instinct.
Yeah, and then we see Baguette actually using that Bloodlust for that first initial pull that they're doing. That's a lot of trash that they got on top of Ruth there, with that 50% healing reduction on top of that as well. We saw the Master Spell just now come in by the Shadow Priest, but they still got a lot of other stacks afterwards, so they had to commit some immunities as and also the Dwarf Rachels coming in too. You can see a lot of them playing Dwarf, meaning they can just dispel the bursting once every 2 minutes.
Yeah, this is actually such a powerful composition for handling that bursting affix, because bursting is so scary when you're fighting a tormented mob that is giving everybody a healing reduction as everything is dying. So definitely they needed to commit all of those resources to get through that pull. Now they won't have them as they get into this big pull. They should have Master Spell back, I guess. That thing's pretty short cooldown. But they won't have their Dwarf Racials. And you can see they're just trying to start grouping everything together. Psychic Scream going to be used here, but that's actually sending a couple of those in the other direction, but they can't worry about that right now. They have to just keep their tank alive, and there's that big AoE stun. But because of that fear, a couple of mobs aren't even in that stun, so they're going to come back and keep hitting the tank here. Looks like they've stabilized fairly well for now, but soon that stun is going to expire, and they're going to need to start kiting.
Yeah, very interesting fear cast there. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe one of those casts went off that would be disorienting the healer, possibly. If there's not enough people in combat, then that happens sometimes. Maybe that's what would have went through if he didn't use that fear there. Which, of course, it's more desirable to have some mobs run off than to have your healer die. So maybe that's what happen. As Practice, though, on the other hand, they are dealing with that Hakar trash. So lots of High Priests and Hexers as well that they have to interrupt and deal with. Looks like they dealt with it pretty quickly, though. They did 2 pulls in total in this area, which is pretty good.
And now they're... So this is the strategy here with the Bloodlust as well, right? Is Practice has saved their Lust for the first 3 minutes of this dungeon so that they can use it on Hakar, whereas Baguette instead used it on the Ardenweald trash pull. Now, my guess is that both teams are probably going to end up using their second Lust where the other team used their first Lust, but we'll have to see. I think Hakar is the more mandatory of those Lusts.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It is not tyrannical, but even on a 45 keep, a 21 Hakar still has so much HP, and they did change the boss a little, made it slightly easier to deal with, but it still does a lot of AoE damage that needs to be out-healed. So still just a boss where you want to commit that Bloodlust because of all of those suns continuously spawning and respawning and just doing a huge amount of AoE damage with that Blood Nova, as you can see on Practice side. And look at the Rogue's damage. I mean, Rogue's just so good for these kind of single target fights where they can funnel some damage with additional targets right there. Baguette, though, still dealing with that Ardenweald area, and Baguette is going to be ahead on trash for quite a long time now, because such a huge portion of your trash is being done in that Ardenweald area, and since Practice took a complete different route, they're going to be behind on trash until they also reach that Ardenweald area themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to compare the percentages, right? Because, like, you know, even though you get 50% from Ardenweald very quickly, it's not like there's another good 50% left in the dungeon, right? You have to get the remaining 50% with all these less good pulls in the Hakar wing and in the Mechagon wing. So even though Practice is going to have less count, you know, they've still done a good job. It is going to be really hard to just compare those percentages against each other because they still have those good pulls in their future and available for them, whereas Baguette has already used them.
Yeah, definitely. Baguette now on their way to Sayaxa, I believe. We've seen a lot of teams last weekend pull a lot of trash on top of the boss here, which I believe is going to happen as well for Baguette. None of the affixes really prevents you from pulling the boss. It's not, you don't have anything like bolstering, or even Sanguine would be probably a problem as well. So Baguette is going to be engaging that boss. And just one thing that is a problem for them is they don't have the Lust. We've seen last weekend, we've seen a lot of teams commit the Bloodlust for this Sayaxa pull here, and then afterwards they committed it for Hakar. But since Baguette lasted that first trash pull, they don't have the Bloodlust for this pull. So that's why it took them a little while before they actually were healthy enough to engage the boss. They waited for the trash to all gather up, got it a little bit lower, and then they pulled the boss. But this is definitely not easy to deal with that bursting that keeps getting applied to the group. You can see everyone dropping really low from bursting, and then you also have the debuff that needs to be passed around as well, that Chain Lightning. And then you have to jump up, and while you're jumping, you can't really heal. So that's why everyone just starts incredibly low, and their Holy Paladin having a pretty difficult time getting everyone back up.
Yeah, a lot of personal responsibility here for players to stay alive. If you've been watching these health bars on the side of Baguette, you know, players are dropping to like 10% health on this fight. Defensives are being used in a really, really good way, though. All of these players are actually making an incredibly impressive personal display of player skill here, because you can see, you know, stuff like Desperate Prayer being used to save priests' lives. Most priests I play with, they'll just die rather than ever pressing that button or even putting it on their action bar. So very cool to see these players really taking responsibility for their own lives.
And then we also see Practice doing a really great job with that pull. This is something we talked about last weekend as well. Just such an efficient pull. Pulling that drill that does the AoE where you have the haywire, where you have to line of sight around the corner, and you pull it in such a way that the rest of your team can be line of sight dealing with other trash, while the rogue uses his Cloak of Shadows and keeps hitting that high HP mob during the haywire so you can get it lower HP. And then once the haywire is over, you just pull it into the other trash group that the rest of your team is fighting, and then you just finish it off before the next haywire comes out. And that's exactly what Practice did and executed really well. Riki, though, unfortunately going down, as I believe they attempted to do a skip here. Didn't quite manage to get it off. Riku actually not playing, like, he has no way of actually de-aggroing. Like, he's not playing Shadow Melt, he's not Night Elf. So the only way for him to get through something is by actually using that Shroud from the Rogue or using Invisibility Potion.
Yeah, interesting. You know, sometimes even those sorts of deaths can just be part of the plan, right? Where you've just got somebody who can't quite make it through. I don't think this was one of those, though. Yeah, I think you're right that this was just an accidental pull, and that's the challenge of skipping in the Mechagon area is you need to go such a long distance, but your shrouds, your invis pots, all those sorts of effects are pretty short duration, and so you start getting to the end, and you're like, oh no, this is expiring. Okay, go ahead and res me.
Yeah, then it's also dangerous because there's some mobs like the lubricators that actually have global combat. So if you mess up a skip and you accidentally get in combat with one of those, then it might even cause further problems that the rest of your group that weren't in combat initially are also going to go down. So definitely not too easy of a skip to execute, but it looked like practice were fine, except of course that one death on Riku and that Windwalker. Now they are dealing with Millhouse and Maleficent though. None of the affixes really affecting this boss at all. Storming of course can spawn, but shouldn't really be a problem for them. As they're dealing with Millhouse and Maleficent just now. Baguette, of course, having that different route that they did, they're now out of the Ardenweald area and dealing with some trash in this like middle ring. Not sure if they're gonna deal with this Enraged Spirit. Sometimes you get a little bit of a bad timing with the patrol, and I'm not sure if that's what's happening here. Yeah, it looks like. Okay, so they just got the distract in from the Rogue, and they're now using that slow fall.
They pulled it.
Somebody forgot to... Oh, they pulled it. Okay, so it seems like they want to deal with it. Yeah, so it's...
I think
that's actually heartbreaking because they waited so long.
Yeah.
They waited so long and then have to deal with it after all.
Yeah, skipping this is definitely a time save, and also it's just a resource save, right? You see people are having to use defensives against this Enraged Spirit, and it's going to get another Rage Cast as well if they're not careful here. It's about to get to that second Rage Cast, which they should have enough health to survive, but on 21 Fortified, yeah, if that thing had actually cast for a while, that would have been pretty damaging to them. So definitely a little bit of a time loss there for Baguette. Not insurmountable, though, and it's hard to reliably skip these spirits as well because, you know, you end up needing to use this space for the last boss fight as well, so it adds an extra chance of failure there, too.
Yeah, definitely. And now we see... one thing to note as well is that both the Frost Mages here play Night Fae. But I think the reason for that is literally just because they don't have a Night Fae otherwise, right? This is, of course, a Night Fae dungeon, so they wouldn't be able to activate those urns without a Night Fae. And since all of a sudden, since 9.1, a lot of classes actually don't want to play Night Fae anymore, which was the most common DPS covenant for a long time previously. But now a lot of classes actually play different covenants. So sometimes one of the damage dealers or the tank or the healer have to sacrifice themselves to play the covenant for the dungeon. And of course the paladin cannot play Night Fae. The paladin needs to stay Venthyr because that's the only... That's the reason why the paladin is even there. And I'm not sure how bad Night Fae is for a demon hunter tank, for a vengeance demon hunter.
It's actually not... It's not bad at all. It's
okay.
It's a little bit harder to make AoE threat consistently. Like you only have your Covenant ability like every other pull rather than every pull, but it is definitely something that's like... It is less of a cost than having your Paladin swap, for sure.
Yeah, I guess for Frost Mage's Night Fae, it's not
It's fine, yeah.
that bad, right? Yeah, it's still good for AoE as well to have it, so it's not like a huge DPS loss to go Night Fae specifically for this dungeon, even though we usually do see them play something like Venthyr, or sometimes even Kyrian in other dungeons as well.
When we've seen them play Kyrian, it is to get the Kyrian buff usually, is why we've seen them usually make that choice, actually, so...
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So I guess the mages are just the ones that are the most versatile or don't care too much about their covenant and can just switch around depending on what they need in the current dungeon.
Yeah, Frost in particular, like, they don't really want to be Necrolord, but the other three are all so close that it's absolutely one of the best specs to just make them play whatever Covenant you need. That's going to be something we'll be able to do in next patch on the live servers as well, is just make the mage. Make the mage go whatever Covenant for the dungeon. Looking forward to that.
Me too, as Practice is now moving into that Ardenweald area as well. So they're going to be catching up on that trash percentage that they've been behind on compared to Baguette. And Baguette, on the other hand, is now moving into that Macagon area too. This is still incredibly close. Of course, Practice having those 2 deaths on the board, not too good in their favor. But Baguette, it looked like some of the trash pulls that Baguette did felt like it was a bit slower compared to Practice. But we will see. It also looks like they're doing this trash skip as well. The rogue just went ahead, activated the engineering button, making sure those slams disappear, and now they're through the lubricators too. Looks like they're dealing with these oils though. Practice, on the other hand, just doing their Ardenweald, huge pulls, you know, just mage things. I guess Windwalker things as well, whenever the cooldowns are back up for Riku.
Yeah, whenever he's not getting thrown away from the group by the tornadoes as well.
Yes.
Melee life there. Yeah, it's actually, I mean, it is still hard to tell which team is ahead here. I think I prefer Practice's position, but it's it's really hard to say that when they have less count and more deaths than the other team, but I think they're in a better spot in the dungeon. It's really hard to tell. A lot is going to come down to just how big they're going to be able to go here, and it actually looks like they're not going that big on this pull, and they're not even going to have to commit the urn to this pull, which means the next pull is likely to be the really big one from Practice.
Yeah, and both of the teams now have their Bloodlust available again. It's interesting because Baguette is in this wing now, right? If they could have went to Hakar, that would have been great, because then Bloodlust would have just come up specifically for that boss. But it's very unlikely that they get another Bloodlust after this one anyway. So at this point, it doesn't necessarily matter how long they hold it for, as long as they use it for the most efficient pull, right? So I would assume that Baguette is holding it for Hakar, and Practice, it could be a Sayaxa pull, or it could just be like one of those huge urn pulls that you talked about that they're going for, maybe.
Yeah, it's going to be... I think that we're at the stage in the dungeon where both teams are only going to get one more Bloodlust as well. I don't foresee this one going past the 25-minute mark, so they really do have no pressure on pressing that Bloodlust button, right? Sometimes you're in a dungeon and it's like, oh, there's 11 minutes left in the dungeon, our Bloodlust is available, we need to press it right now. But when there's less than 10 minutes left in the dungeon, you actually have no pressure at all, right? You can just hold it for whatever you think is going to be the most important. For Baguette, that answer actually is the Mana Storms here. They are using the Bloodlust right now, so that is their decision instead of saving for Hakar or Moizala. So we'll see how that works out for them. Maybe they actually do anticipate getting a third Lust in this dungeon, but I would be surprised. That would mean the dungeon has gone on really long, just compared to like historical times in this dungeon.
Yeah, that's actually very surprising that they're committing in here for Maleficent and Millhouse. I don't remember ever seeing a team even using Lust here for this boss, especially since it's not even tyrannical either. I guess you could argue it's just efficient because this boss takes a long time, there's no trash you can pull on top of this boss, and if Hakar is not really an issue for you, if that's not going to be a problem, then for efficiency reasons, it doesn't really matter if you use it on this boss or on Hakar, because on both bosses, there's no trash you can pull on top, really, and it's just like this single target slug that you have to go through, and if for whatever reason all of their cooldowns just came up for Millhouse and Maleficent and it just kind of worked out, then I guess for time reasons it would make sense to use it here anyway. But Practice is actually dealing with that mini-boss here. They're pulling the dragon, which is something that we've seen a lot of teams just skip. But Practice, they want to deal with the dragon, as they also just pull a lot of other trash on top of it and just cleaving it down. Yeah,
they're sort of dragging it all around the room there, and they've now finished off that one and are working on the rest of the trash. Pretty small amounts of trash here, actually. This is only 5 more mobs coming in at the end, but they needed a lot of count from Ardenweald, right? This is the last wing of the dungeon for them. They need to get all the way up to 100% here, or else it is a disaster, right? And they're going to have to backtrack, so... definitely something that they needed all this count, because they did skip more earlier, right? We saw Baguette doing extra stuff in that Mechagon wing, right? Doing those oils that Practice skipped.
Yeah, and Baguette now done with the boss. Now we can
Free break.
compare the teams a bit more, right? Because Practice actually has more trash percentage now, but the same amount of bosses stat as well on the board. So looks like Practice might be slightly ahead now because of that 6% extra trash that they have done. And on top of that, they're still in the Ardenweald area, which means they're going to get even more trash in just a second. The reason why they just fooded up there was because they're about to do this insane pull where they just run through, get all of the trash, and they're going to be pulling it on top of Zayaxa. Very likely to see the Bloodlust here as well. And we just saw a Rogue be a team player and basically solo that hatchling that you don't want to have the cast go off. Otherwise, that matriarch is going to be aggroing, and then all of those mobs are going to be enraged, which is not something you want to see.
Practice going to use their second Bloodlust of the dungeon on this. I much prefer Practice's Bloodlust in this dungeon to Baguettes, actually, where they were able to get them used, because look at just how much trash they're going to be able to kill with this, and it's overlapping with doing effective boss damage, and their Ashen Hallows, all of their big cooldowns like that. So really, really high value Bloodlust coming out from Practice. They do need to watch out for this bursting. You can see Dwarf Racial is being used pretty aggressively here. Cloak of Shadow is also going to catch bursting stacks and the AoE from the boss, and they have survived all of that. Now they just have the last 40% of this boss's health, but look how fast they've done this all. 86% count here for Practice, so they still do need a little bit more. Maybe what they'll do is they'll get it still from the Ardenweald area. They'll just like take the port back up to the top and then get some trash up there. Otherwise, I'm not really sure where the remaining 14% would come from. I guess the very start of the dungeon, right? So maybe how much does that pull add up to? Is that 14?
I think that's like 8%.
Okay.
So they definitely have to do something else. It is possible that there's some extra trash that they left. I think the Warlords is still a pull that they can do somewhere. Not sure if they will be doing that during the boss fight. That would be interesting for sure. Then that will be an incredibly efficient strategy. We'll see how they're dealing with this. But yeah, one more thing I wanted to note real quick is that all three of their damage dealers actually went with the volcanic anima power from those tormentors, and that's why all of these trash mobs just constantly got knocked in the air just now as they were dealing with the mob, with the boss and the trash. And I think if you're doing these really big pulls, then this volcanic power definitely has a big advantage because it helps you interrupt them. But in this Ardenweald area, none of these mobs actually cast anything that is dangerous that they need to interrupt. So I wonder if they just took it for the extra damage, maybe. They thought it might have a lot of value damage-wise.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see here. Practice now are going to be shrouding past, so they left this trash out in front of that Ardenweald area, and they are going to pull it into boss. So if they have this and the front pack of the dungeon, I think that will be the count they need. Actually, the question is this going into boss or not? Because they actually still have the urn here as well. So maybe they're just going to do this before the boss. That makes a lot of sense, because that would be pretty scary with the start of the boss fight. So that's going to be their plan here. This will get them up to... Let's see what the count ends up being, like 95-ish? Yeah, something like that. And then they'll get on this last boss. Meanwhile, Baguette still have to do Hakar and then get to Moizala as well. And they're also still behind on count. So Practice definitely in the driver's seat here. If they can successfully execute this boss with that trash at the front of the dungeon, I think they're going to have a minute or two to spare against Baguette in this one. But this is not easy at all. This is a very tough boss fight, and that is some very tough trash to add into it at the start of the dungeon as well. It is 21 fortified, so that means that the individual platforms will require some cooldowns, but they should be doable for all of these specs. There shouldn't be an issue of like, hey, even with all my cooldowns and a potion, I can't kill it. But you never know. Sometimes weird stuff happens on those platforms and you just don't get any crits. We'll see.
That is true. We'll see if they're gonna be able to get those visages done, as they only have one Tormentor debuff here. The only Tormentor that they didn't kill is Sogodon, so they have that 50% physical damage increase. They're gonna have to look out for that tank damage, and it's gonna be a little bit increased, and it's gonna hurt quite a lot. So that's something they have to look at, especially because of the trash that they're pulling after the intermission phase. It's just gonna be added pressure onto their Vengeance Demon Hunter. And you can see just how low he just dropped on that tank mechanic there as a drop. The intermission just started. We'll see how well they are with dealing with this intermission. The Holy Paladin, of course, going with the tank, making sure they have enough damage. And let's see just how low that Visage drops and how fast.
Yeah, this is the tank healer platform. Usually one of the actually easiest platforms as well. When you have a high damage tank and a high damage healer, they usually add up to like more than a DPS's worth of damage to these things. Although it is starting to get a little bit close here. Can't actually see the health bar of the Visage as well. Okay, they've done it. They've got it. And they're going to hit the totem. It's actually going to be the healer hitting the totem and the tank already getting in position to start this pull. This is a really good way to make this safe, right? Make sure you have threat as you're landing. Everything's grouped up. The Sigil of Silence is there. The Ashen Hallow is going to come down for practice as well as that haste buff starts ramping up on them. You can see the Volcanic Plumage anima power as well. Really doing a good job of just controlling all those mobs and stopping them from really doing anything also. And you can see Moisala's health here, 35%. That means they did miss a platform, so they are going to have to do another full phase here. They do just need to make sure that they can stop this trash from killing them. One of those mobs still left here. Most of the danger is done. Now they just have to get that last platform kill.
Yeah, not sure what happened there. It almost looked like no one was even at that platform. So I wonder if someone just went wrong or if they kind of knew.
Yeah.
Maybe it was planned. Yeah, it's possible that they thought it's better to do it this way. Sometimes that is a life strategy where teams just decide to do a two-phase from the get-go. But they're having some issues here because their Paladin is actually completely out of mana. Just had to use Lay on Hands to keep one of their players alive as well. And they're dropping pretty low. So they need to make sure that they're going to stay alive here, get through that last combo. They're dropping low as well, as it looked like he got hit by that explosion on the floor. But they're through, and once this Visage goes down and they're going to be ported back, the boss is going to be done. So they are fine. They just have to finish off this Visage, which they are very likely going to be able to do with all those 5 players there.
Yeah, I think they might have enough damage, and they've done it. They've killed the Visage. And at 100% count as well. They don't need to kill this cultist either, but there's nothing else to do while they wait for that timer to elapse on this intermission phase. You always have to wait that full time, even once you hit all the totems. So it is a serious cost that is incurred anytime you don't manage to kill all 4 in the first phase. But at this point, yeah, now they're literally just waiting for that timer to elapse, and as soon as it does, Moisala is going to go from 30 down to 10 and end the dungeon just from 1 Somni's damage. At this time, there's just no way Baguette can finish this boss in 10 seconds, so Practice are going to take game 1 in the series.
That's right, Practice taking the victory on the other side, and unfortunately, Baguette, like you mentioned, they didn't have any deaths or anything, but it seemed like they were kind of just loafing around a little bit too much on this one, Tettles.
Yeah, they were looking a bit soggy. Some of the pulls that they were doing was just a little bit smaller than the very practice pulls that Practice ended up implementing. Notably, some of the ones that were in the Mana Storms wing with like the race car and the Arf Arf was one of the bigger ones. That's actually a pretty massive time save. And I think that it's just like, it comes down to just the general pathing. Practice just looked like they were a little bit more refined on their pathing and had a slightly better idea as to what is going to be the biggest time save for some of these wings.
Yeah, and we've always been looking at, okay, are we going left side, are we going right side, what's the group composition going to be looking like and everything like that. And it seems like we're always seeing, some familiar faces as well throughout this. We're always seeing, like, for example, like the Shadow Priest. We're seeing, like, rogues just being brought in, like, crazy abundance as well, Dratnos. But we're still seeing variety in terms of where teams are actually going.
Yeah, there are definitely different decisions made there. I do think that Practices ended up being ones that shaved a lot of time off of this dungeon relative to the Baguette strategy. Even though you could tell Baguette strategy was a little bit safer, right? They were kind of separating their Ashen Hallow from their Lust in a couple spots, right? They were doing, okay, we have Ashen Hallow for this big pull, we have Lust for this big pull, we have Ashen Hallow for the boss, right? We're going to Lust the Mana Storms, we're going to do these pulls, and we're not going to have any deaths in our run. But when you compare that to Practice that is instead stacking, Ashen Hallow, Lust, Boss, all the trash in the wing, right? Like, that just does the dungeon in fewer pulls, and those pulls take less time. So even if you have a couple of deaths, those multiplicative effects are a huge time save.
Yeah. And Tettles, let's start going through it as well. I mean, when we start talking about those time saves, like Dratnos mentioned and everything, it just seemed like Baguette, what was it that they were missing there?
Yeah, so I actually think that their Arden Willed wing from Baguette made a lot of sense, but whenever you compare it to the Hakar wing from Practice, look at this this pull that they were doing in this Hakar Wing is so well done. They utilize that urn. They're doing what is effectively one of the hardest pulls in the dungeon right off the rip, and having all of their offensive CDs for this, it really helps them be able to pull this off. Whereas on the side of Baguette, they were doing this Ardent Wield Wing. They did it in like a pretty normal manner, but a lot of the times it felt like they had to kite a bunch of the trash for extended periods of time, and it just started to slow them down as a whole. That, coupled with their slightly worse strategy in the Mechagon Wing compared to practices, absolutely massive pull that we like. It's an adaptation of a pull that we saw from last weekend from Perplexed and Team Name, where they were doing that race card in the Arfarf. And like being able to do that pull from practice, I felt like saved them a lot of time over Baguette. And then on top of that, practice running the triple volcanic plume trait, just knocking all these mobs up the whole entire time, keeping them stacked and allowing all of this just incidental cleave damage from the Windwalker Monk, from that Frost Mage, from that Subtlety Rogue, just able to get all of that damage in. It allowed them to save a significant amount of time just keeping the mobs stacked up, and then from then on out they were pretty far ahead on Moizala, and it was just kind of, the writing was on the wall already. Once they did make it to Moizala, they were already a few minutes ahead.
Yep, and with that, it's going to be putting Baguette down 1, and we start kind of setting our sights here, Nagura, on the next game, because we haven't seen Sanguine Depths just yet this weekend.
Yeah, I think the Sanguine Depths is going to be a difficult one, because first of all, it is 22. Last week it was 19 only, so now it's the highest key level, and it's also tyrannical with Inspiring and Quaking. I think in this dungeon specifically, I think Syro was scared about the Quaking because all of those hallways are so narrow. You have such little space to actually spread out with your Quaking. And then on top of that, you can't really see or interrupt the mobs. And there's so many dangerous trash mobs. Even if they're not fortified, I think this is going to be a very dangerous combination of a key level plus affixes as well.
Yeah, we really went from like the easiest possible Sanguine Depths with like Fortified and what was it, Spiteful as well, to further amp up those jars and everything. And now we're, again, still using live affix combinations as well, Drat. It's important to note this was last week's affix combo, but still quite difficult in this one.
Yeah, if you didn't get enough of Sanguine Depths last week, you can hop on the Tournament Realm and run this MDI set of affixes here.
Yeah.
The Tyrannical, Inspiring, Quaking Sanguine Depths, actually one of the toughest dungeons for this affix combo. You know, Quaking in particular, in the narrow confines of Sanguine Depths, is one of the places where you will feel that affix the most. And there are a couple of nasty Inspiring mobs scattered throughout here as well. A lot of packs where, you know, it'd be really nice if you could just have your Volcanic Plumage interrupting everything for you, and because of the Inspiring mob, that's no longer possible. However, all that being said, still the hardest part is going to be 22 tyrannical bosses, especially if they're pulling trash onto them. I think there's a non-zero chance that we will see some struggle against really any of the, especially the first 3 bosses in here in this dungeon.
And important to note as well, I mean, for a little while, there was a moment where some of those ticks early on to Crixus were not exploding at all, so you could do some pretty crazy pulls with Inspiring and just say, oh yeah, you guys can drain me, I'll heal through that, no problem, they don't explode. But some of those really early pulls are going to be exceptionally dangerous as a result, Titles, because now they are going to explode.
Yeah, exactly, and on top of that, if for some reason the Incinerator also ends up getting inspired, we could have a cast going off from that. On top of that, there are some other issues where you want to pull those Spritelings typically into some of those like Overseer packs, those type of mobs, where they also have the Silence Decurse ability on those as well. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, and I think that one of the biggest issues, while the bosses were those are a known variable to be very difficult on a 22 Tyrannical, I think that just having 1 or 2 people die with the 10 stack of Lantern buff and then losing that for some reason can start to cascade into bigger issues long term if you do have 1 or 2 mistakes. So it's going to come down to just how much preparation these teams were able to put in, how they're going to be able to adapt to mistakes. I suspect that there are going to be mistakes on both ends, but how the teams are able to adapt to those and just make sure that they have the cleanest run they possibly can is going to be the most important thing here.
Yeah, and Sanguine Depths is definitely one of the biggest like momentum dungeons in Agura. If you, like Title's mentioned, you miss out on one of the buffs or you don't roll one of the jar buffs into another one. I mean, I always try to tell people, if like the Gauntlet, you always want to be as aggressive as you possibly can to make sure that you always have stacks of your jar to be able to clear through the next trash packs here, and just one mistake can just be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, and especially in these MDI-style dungeons, surely they have their offensive cooldowns assigned to each boss, because all of those bosses are actually really hard. Even though they got nerfed numerous times, they're still very difficult to deal with on a tyrannical scenario. So you probably have assigned, let's say, on the first boss, maybe you use Bloodlust. On the second boss, you use that the Lantern buffs to deal with that, and then maybe you have buffs again or a Bloodlust for the third boss. And if something goes wrong and you lose those buffs along the way, then all of a sudden you don't have those offensive cooldowns that you need to deal with that specific boss on a 22 tyrannical. So yeah, definitely not easy to recover if there's anything that goes wrong.
Yeah, you know, last week in particular, Dratnos, we saw some teams who were bringing the jar buff into the boss. They were grabbing the very last trash pack of the instance, pulling it into General Call with the full stack of the jar and all their cooldowns and everything all together. But that was unfortified and 19. And now we're going into 22 and tyrannical. And keep in mind, that was with, I think, 3 Tormentor debuffs as well at the end of the instance. So I don't know if they're going to be able to do something like that on this level of affix and this level of difficulty.
Yeah, I have a feeling we aren't going to see 3 Tormented Auras on the last boss on 22 Tyrannical, but I would love to be proven wrong. Honestly, even just more than 1 would be pretty scary on that boss. Like, it is tough on 22 Tyrannical. It's a boss fight that can last like 30 seconds on 19 Fortified, but 22 Tyrannical, now you're talking about more like a minute 30 seconds because you don't have just all your cooldowns to kill it with. But wow, look at this first pull underway here from both teams. So much trash getting pulled here by both of them.
Wow, that's actually an absolutely crazy pull as they gather it all up on top of that initial Lantern at the very start of the area. We already see lots of damage ramping up here by the Windwalker and also by the Affliction Warlock with that Seed of Corruption spam that you can see him do there. 2 Frost Mages as well, playing that Night Fae Covenant as well, making sure they have all of that AoE damage that they need to get done with these pulls before the mobs kill them, because there's a couple of inspired mobs in there, so none of these mobs actually can be interrupted. They just have to make sure that they kill them before any of those casts can bother them too much. Jonaka already moving ahead, making sure that Gateway is down to be able to just get there quicker. This is very interesting, actually. It looks like he's just standing there waiting to speed up the rest of the group. He's playing Affliction Warlock with like a full AoE build, and once most of the trash is dead and there's only 1 mob left, it's probably more efficient to walk ahead and put a Gateway than the damage that he could be doing on that single target mob, probably.
Yeah, the Affliction Warlock is a really cool choice for this dungeon. It is really good for these AoE trash pulls. You are relying on the other 4 members of your group to deal with single targets, though. However, in a situation like this, like look at this big pull they're doing onto the boss. He's going to do huge damage, and a lot of that is going to translate onto the boss because of all the targets here. You know, just spamming seeds into these targets is going to do. I mean, look at the overall here, and yeah, a lot of that is just overall damage on the ads, but a lot of it is actually being dealt to the boss as well.
Yeah, and he was actually holding on to his cooldowns here, to his Dark Glare as well. He didn't use it on that initial pull. Made sure he has it up for this specific pull here, while the other damage dealers were using their cooldowns initially. So really well done, as both of them also are committing the Bloodlust too for this. Baguette also pulling a lot of trash onto Crixus. He dealt with the first pull slightly slower. As you can see, they also pulled the boss quite a bit slower. And I think a lot of it has to do with that Affliction Warlock as well. I mean, even though the Windwalker does do a huge amount of damage, I don't think quite as much single target translates onto the boss compared to the Affliction Warlock, right? As you said, I think the Affliction definitely a little bit more valuable in these AoE pulls if you want to get the boss lower.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't factor out the extra 2 seconds from everybody on the team taking that Gateway as well. So that huge Warlock utility coming in there. Another thing you can see actually is the Banish on the Inspiring mob. Nice little piece of utility for that. I suppose that Incapacitate from the Monk does the same thing, although that has a danger of breaking, whereas Banish never will. They have 2 ticks here, crowd controlled on the side of practice. I wonder when they're going to deal with them. It looks like they're going to do it now, or are they going to do anything else with these, or are they just cleaning these up at the end of the boss fight? And if that's the answer, I wonder if there was a way they could have pulled them into the boss, maybe right after the boss finished a cast. Oh, I see what they have to do here. Because they would inspire each other, they need to keep them separated so that they don't cast that Engorge freely. Yeah, I see. That's kind of brutal, actually, the way that they have to handle these 2 mobs.
Yeah, so it looks like this is taking quite a long time, unfortunately, for them to finish it off. I guess you were right. They maybe could have pulled 1 tick into the boss right after a cast went through, dealt with that one, and then pulled the other one in. But yeah, the boss is casting something as well that needs to be interrupted, and if you don't kill the inspired mob fast enough, then that's gonna kill a person for sure if that cast goes through and cannot be interrupted by the boss. But it looks like Practice now actually backtracking a little bit here, very likely because of Bloodlust timing and cooldown timing. They wanted to make sure they get those cooldowns out of the way on the boss pull, and now they are moving back, making sure they deal with Arkaleth here. Arkaleth, definitely a Tormentor mob you want to do before you get to the last boss. You do definitely not want to have that ticking fire dot on your whole group on a tyrannical 22 boss fight.
Yeah, probably one of the scariest things is if that does happen, so definitely something they do want to avoid. And yeah, like you mentioned, usually it is a little odd to see teams backtracking in the MDI. Anytime you're doing that, it's usually indicating that you've got an inefficiency in the plan, but sometimes there's just no getting around it, especially in this dungeon, because of the way the Venthyr lanterns work. There's just you need the Venthyr lanterns for that big pull onto the boss, right? You need that damage buff for that, and so you just have to go straight to boss after you activate the Venthyr lanterns. But then you have to go back and finish Arkaleth afterwards as well, because, like you said, nobody in their right mind is doing that with the last boss. So that all that logic works out. It ends up being that you have to backtrack, but do what you got to do.
The Reflection Warlock's just sitting there using bandages on himself, because the healers just don't heal, Sometimes
Holy
you're just gonna
Paladins.
take care of it yourself. As the Holy Paladin is just not able to get him topped off. Now another huge pull coming in here with a bunch of expired mobs, so none of these mobs are going to be able to be interrupted, which is really scary because there's a bunch of oppressors in there which cast a pretty heavy damage effect, Wicked Soul, onto your team if it's not interrupted. But it looks like they're dealing with it pretty well, as they have a bunch of offensive cooldowns coming back up here that are being committed, making sure the trash dies before they die.
Yeah, they should have damage for this next pull as well. You can see Dark Glare just about available from Dranako, so depending on how big they go with this, they should be able to do a lot of damage. Dranako, Warlock main, I believe, as well. So one of the benefits of having a Warlock main on your team is that in these kind of tougher dungeons to play Warlock, especially in this one where you have Quaking going on as well, you can rely on them getting close to that full potential all the time, rather than, like, if you were just a usual MDI team, there's a good chance you don't actually have anybody that really plays a lot of Warlock on the team, as it hasn't been that popular for recent seasons. So we do see, I think that is part of the reason why Warlock is one of the specs that is the most commonly seen in one but not both of the teams on the board at any given time.
Yeah, that's definitely Warlock has never really been a spec that you've seen in the MDI or in lower dungeons generally, because they, for the longest time, they just weren't very good at that kind of burst AoE, which is what you need exactly in those speedruns. So usually only those mains that just happen to play Warlock on live servers for other reasons are the ones that actually bring it out here in the MDI as well. But definitely getting a lot more popular lately, with a lot more Warlocks being played last weekend as well. Even Destro Warlock too, in some of the dungeons. Practice though did activate that Lantern as they're dealing with this double Oppressor pack. Overseer, sorry, they had the back-to-back Overseer pack, as they're now dealing with the third Overseer pack too. So they're not skipping any of this trash. They're also dealing with Baruth, on top of the Overseer, which is decently dangerous because this Overseer is also inspired. So not only do you get that stacking debuff on you that reduces your damage done, you also cannot interrupt those Wicked Soul casts that go off on the whole group. And then on top of that, you have a 50% healing reduction on everybody. So this is pretty crazy. They're not even focusing the Overseer, they're dealing with Varuth first.
Look at the damage here from that Holy Paladin. I actually love this pathing from practice because these sorts of really ambitious and scary pulls after you get a Venthyr Lantern buff is just such a great way to attack this dungeon. You know, you get so much useful stuff done. You're getting one of your anima powers. You know, you're killing these high trash count mobs that are kind of annoying to skip. And, you know, you're just getting all of this done that can only really be done because you have the Venthyr Lantern. And anytime your route does pulls after a Venthyr Lantern that only work because you have the Venthyr Lantern, that's usually a really good sign.
Yeah, definitely. And now we see that they finally reached this probably the most scariest area with quaking, because the hallway here, this ring, is pretty narrow. So there's a lot of other stuff that you have to dodge on the floor. These pools that are being dropped, as well as the area of denial from the gargoyles as well that you need to dodge. And then on top of that, you have that quaking as well. So we'll see how they handle with this one. Hopefully they don't have any bad timings with the quaking either, as both of them did activate the lantern. And you can see Baguette is actually not that far behind at all. Even though they were a little bit slower in that first pool, they did catch up quite a bit, as they're now in a very similar spot in the dungeon. And you can see, if you look at the trash percentage, they are catching up. They're still a little bit behind, as Practice is probably one trash pool ahead, but still in the realm of possibilities that Baguette can somehow catch up here.
Yeah, this is definitely still a close dungeon run. These are, again, two of our closest seeded... Well, actually, you know what? There are actually so many close-seeded matchups that are possible in our bracket this weekend, but this is certainly one of them. There are only a couple of placements away in time trials, and you can see there's just, I think just two different philosophies at play here. I think Practice is going with these big, aggressive, MDI-sized strategies, whereas Baguette is instead on this, you know, slower and steadier plan. And it's easy to say that Practice's is better here, but that's because it's working out for them so far, right? It could all fall apart any time on pulls as scary as these ones, and then Baguette would look really good for having played a little bit more conservatively and with strategies less likely to fail. Again, Baguette still on 0 deaths in this whole series, so definitely to be commended on that.
Yeah, it looks incredibly clean what Practice is doing so far. They dealt with this Warden pack as well without having any of the inspired mobs stop them from interrupting the chain cast, which is incredibly deadly if not interrupted. So they had this to see on the scribe, which is the inspired one, and now they're using the scribe to just extend their debuff one last time, as you can see, before they move on to very likely the boss. But Baguette having some issues.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the 0 deaths all series, the first one is going to come out. Look at Teef here, though. Look at the way he's using that trinket. That trinket reduces damage taken from in front of you, and he moved himself into a choke point. Did a really good job of staying alive, even when the healer was gone, using that really, really powerful trinket from the raid, the 9 trinket for tanks. Actually does, if you looked at that healing done breakdown, I would wager that a solid 7,000 of that HPS is coming just from that trinket.
Yeah, and unfortunately, their Demon Hunter here, their Vengeance Demon Hunter on Baguette's side, just proccing that cheat death, and on top of that, also used, it looks like they've used Bob to get rid of that physical debuff they had, the bleed effect. So they overlapped some cooldowns there, unfortunately, as the Practice is now dealing with Tarvold, and they also pulled a bunch of trash on top of it to, again, make use of this Affliction Warlock. So many bosses in this dungeon allow you to actually pull trash on top of it. In fact, every single one. On every single one of the bosses, you can pull trash on top, which really gives the Affliction Warlock so much value.
Yeah, if they're just fighting a single target by itself, not so great. But pulling the trash on top, and all of a sudden they are in business, and you can see on the damage meter just how good that spec can be in this kind of situation.
Yeah, dropping a bit low here as the Paladin goes down with that last Castigate cast that went off on the boss. Probably stacking up a little bit as well. I thought they maybe they thought that they can finish off the boss before the Castigate goes out, and then they just didn't quite manage. So they have to go and summon their paladin because they don't actually have a rest class at all. This is interesting. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. They don't have a single class who can use an out-of-combat rest, so the only way they could get the paladin up is either use a battle rest with an engineering rest or a soulstone, or summon him. And of course they chose to summon him, which doesn't cost them that battle rest on the board.
Distract coming out here from Riku, making sure that Oppressor doesn't path into Sagadon. Is he going to go forward and try and land a sap? Yes, that's exactly what he's going to do. Keeping that mob in exactly that position, meaning they won't have to deal with it as they fight all of these other casters with the boss, and they have gone back-to-back bosses with trash, one after the other. That's a really impressive thing to be able to do, because it means they have to really carefully assign their cooldowns. Look at the way that Silent Sigil, though, is working, and now all of their damage ramping up here as the Veins and the Dark Glare are both coming out. Big damage on everything. Riku cloaks a millisecond late there and takes heavy damage, but is going to stay alive. The entire team able to deal with all of those trash mobs, and I mean huge damage coming out from all three of their damage dealers and their rogue as well.
Yeah, so I actually thought they would be committing the bloodlust here for this boss because they also pulled that trash on top, but it looks like they're holding on to it, possibly for the last boss, which can also be very dangerous and also just take a long time if you don't have bloodlust for it. It also maybe makes me think that they're not gonna do the strategy with the lantern onto the boss, or they just think that boss is so difficult they need both, like the damage from the lantern plus the bloodlust as well. Or maybe it's just an efficiency because if you can stack a bunch of cooldowns on top of each other, of course that's going to be more efficient than to spread them out if it comes to single target damage. So we'll see what they're going to do later on. They still have two Tormentors theoretically that are left as well. Sagadon is standing in this room here, and
Oro says they've skipped already.
I think they're going to kill it. Because leaving Sagadon alive is actually incredibly dangerous on the last boss here because of that charge. And apparently people said it just straight up one-shots you if you get hit by it. Now, of course, it's dodgeable. Like, you can outrun it, or you can like use a blink or something like that to not get hit. But it's not always that easy. And risking a one-shot if a person fails a skip of that ability seems a bit dangerous. So we'll see if they deal with it after this boss or not.
Yeah, the Bloodlust is really interesting because it makes me think maybe they are going to try and just nuke down the last boss, right? When you have Bloodlust, you know, Bloodlust scales better for single target than it does for AoE for most specs. So that is another reason they might be considering it for the last boss. But I think it is possible that with a 10 stack of the Lantern and Bloodlust on pull, with the the burst damage of, say, a Subtlety Rogue and an Affliction Lock on pull, maybe they can get that boss killed before it gets too many charges out. Even if it does cast a lot, as long as they're confident in their dodges as well, that could help. Maybe it's a case of like, maybe just, oh no, they are going to kill Sagadon, so they're not going too crazy with it. Meanwhile, Baguette actually have a death in this same room here. They do land the battle res, but then they have another death as well. Their healer down now, and they don't have a battle res to save their healer. There's no way they can continue this pull, so Baguette are going to be experiencing a full team wipe here. Oh, and the pod tender, they're going to have to wait for that to... oh, no, okay, that drops combat, so they're actually okay here with that death at least, but really big time advantage has just gone over to Perplexed as a result of that wipe. That was by far the single biggest time loss that we've seen so far this series for either team, that full-on wipe there. Up until this point, it had just been deaths or minor inefficiencies here or there.
Yeah, this is a huge advantage for practice as they still deal with Sagadon here. Seems like an inefficient pull to just deal with Sagadon by himself, but the trash that is after Sagadon here is actually pretty dangerous, and it's difficult to actually pull it on top of a Tormentor, and they're already up to 85% as well, so there really is not much that they need that is left here. So that's why they're also going to use that Shroud, also using the Step to make sure they're not accidentally pulling anything here, and the Distract as well. And yeah, they're just immediately into that Gauntlet as they don't need any additional trash. And they only have one Tormentor left. That one is definitely one that they're gonna have on the boss, which is, if I remember correctly, it's gonna be the slow. So they're gonna have a 50% slow on the last boss, which, yeah, now that I think about it, it's actually, if they would have the 50% physical debuff and the slow, that it's really hard to dodge those charges, right? Even if you only get a couple. So I guess it makes sense that they're dealing with Sagadon, as they're now doing a pretty significant pull here in the Gauntlet area, making sure to deal with General Call.
Okay, hear me out though. A Warlock Gateway in the middle of the room. Okay, a Warlock Gateway in the middle of the room. And then even if you're slowed, you just click on that as the boss starts charging at you, and that gives you an extra dodge. So with that, they could certainly do it, I'm sure.
But what if two people need to use the gateway?
So they both go to opposite ends of the same gateway.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you have the boss in the middle. And then just whoever it charges at first takes the gateway, and then it charges at the other person. Okay, then I guess there's two people on the gateway. Maybe this doesn't work, actually. Hang on.
But they have a bop in that situation, right?
Yeah, and
so one person uses the gateway, the other person uses a bop, and then they have Ice Block as well.
Demonic Circle.
And the Warlock is invincible,
Shadow
right?
Step.
Yeah, they have Demonic Circle, Shadow Step. Yeah, I mean, you're onto something here.
Soul
I guess
Shapes.
the biggest problem is the Paladin.
Paladin
only has Bubble.
Door of Shadows.
Door of Shadows, I don't think that's gonna work.
No.
Right? Because you don't know which charge you get, first or second. And you have to precast it for sure. You can't use it reactively, I don't think.
Maybe, yeah. I remember there used to be a Soulbind that made Door like instant on PTR, or on beta for Shadowlands, so they took that away.
Yeah,
so.
unfortunately that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, that's so sad.
It would be very convenient
okay,
though.
No. You take the two charges of Door of Shadows and you just cast both of them, right? You cast one for the first charge, and then if the second charge is actually the one you have, you're just already casting your second door.
I like it.
It works, yeah. This is the strat.
Baguette having more problems, unfortunately, as their Paladin goes down here, and the boss is still on 20% HP on a Tyrannical fight. It's still a long time. Their Battle Rush still not up. It's just gonna be a couple of seconds until the Battle Rush comes back up, though, so they might be able to get them. There we go, their rest is up. We see one of their damage dealers making sure they get up their Paladin. There we go, their Paladin's back up. They can finish this boss, but that was incredibly scary. Almost wiped again, and you can see how difficult this third boss here is in Sanguine Depths on Tyrannical. It just does so much AoE damage on the group, it's crazy.
Yeah, you think about the MDI setting and it's like, oh, how are we going to do all these crazy pulls? But also it's just like, how are we going to do just a vanilla 22 Tyrannical Grand Proctor Borrelia, right? And that question alone is not something that a lot of players in the world can really do with like a close to a 100% success rate. So it is really impressive the way these teams, especially the way that Practice, for instance, was able to do it with Trash as well. Here they go, though. They have those 10 stacks of Lantern buffs you can see with the red glowy around them. And it looks like they are going to use it for this AoE pull. Oh my goodness gracious.
Oh.
Look at this. They are already into the boss room. Yes, they are. They're going into boss with all this as well.
Wow.
And look at this. Roth is going to pop that extra action button right on pull, because you can do that and still get it back for the first time you need it in the boss fight. So a little bit of extra defensive right at the start of the pull, but they're now slowed as they're dealing with all these mechanics. Look at that Warlock burst, though. Everything is dead already. Oh my goodness.
Well, that's 3 players to up to 70-80k DPS. That's absolutely insane. And those weren't 3 damage dealers. That was 2 damage dealers and 1 healer, as they just popped all of those offensive coolers. Absolutely crazy how fast they dealt with this Trash and the boss too. Boss still 7% left they have to deal with though, so they definitely still have to watch out for this, as they still have that 50% slow that they have to deal with while dodging, and then also have those bleed effects that are going to be applied to them as the charges come out. And fun fact, last week the fastest Sanguine Depths that we saw was by evolving with 14 minutes and 58. And now you can see, even though Practice had a pretty good run, only 1 death on the board, they're already in here for 22 minutes, just because there's a 22 level key on Tyrannical, and the affixes just make this such a hard dungeon, and really increasing the time these teams need to clear this.
Yeah, it is really hard to identify just how close this is to the fastest possible run you could have in here, because I think it looked pretty good. I think they were moving very quickly, but like you mentioned, they do have a much slower time than last week. I do think it is just those affixes. I think that it is a case of it is hard to get this dungeon done quickly on 22 Tyrannical, but Practice have done it 2-0 in the series against Baguette with an impressively clean 22 Tyrannical Sanguine Depths.
That's right, Practice well practiced up for this dungeon, for this series as well.